So we begin this week's session or this month's session rather, on the topic of food. And without further ado, let me start by introducing first speaker for today, Mr. John Ellis. Welcome, John. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being with us. John Ellis is a translator and interpreter based in São Paulo. He trained at Associação Alumni in São Paulo and later at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey, California, the famous MISS. Today, he teaches consecutive and simultaneous interpreting at Alumni, at the same place where he started his training, and his working languages are English, Spanish, Brazilian Portuguese, and French. John Ellis is going to talk to us today about Pimenta Malagueta and the origin of the name. John, take it away.
Okay, thank you so much, Danielle. Hello, everybody. I'm a little nervous, to be quite honest, to be in front of so many colleagues who are working very hard to interpret and make something out of this session. So I hope that I'll do justice to your hard work. In any case, so basically today, what I'd like to do is talk to you about a topic that's near and dear to my heart, mainly because, as most translators and interpreters, we are near and dear to our work. And a lot of my work is related to translation. And in particular, there's one project that kind of stands out in my mind as a formative experience. And that experience was the translation of subtitles for the new exhibition of the Museu da Língua Portuguesa, also known as the Museum of the Portuguese Language. And this is a very unique museum. It's located, first of all, in Brazil, in São Paulo. And what it aims to do is put on display different aspects of the Portuguese language. So if language is already abstract, imagine trying to make exhibits out of that. It's quite difficult. In any case, one of the most fascinating parts of translating this set of subtitles for the new exhibition was the opportunity to engage with Portuguese in a level that I had never actually done, mainly because I'm more of a self-taught. Of course, I got taught by many important people, but for the most part, I didn't do a lot of in-depth training in Portuguese because I learned Portuguese as an adult. And as a result, there were certain things that I didn't know about the Portuguese language. A lot of those gaps got filled by doing this or the translation, that is, of these subtitles, because suddenly the scope of the work that was created for this exhibit wanted to basically cover everything from the very beginnings of the Portuguese language to where we are today, but also the expansion of the Portuguese language throughout the world. And as a result, I ended up calling translators in Cape Verde, for example, to ask them for help to understand certain terms, which were quite difficult. In fact, the Wi-Fi network of my house suddenly became one of these words because it was just such a fascinating experience for me to go after this information and these different words and thinking about the translations that, I couldn't just let it be some job. It had to be part of my day-to-day life. So it's actually the name of my network at home. But in any case, there are lots of aspects that we had to ask ourselves, what are these words? What do they mean? And one of the adventures, I'll say, of doing this translation was when I had to suddenly do the translation of a famous song by Dorival Caymmi. As you know, this is a very important 20th century songwriter in Brazil, also a singer. And one of the things that he brought up was the Pimenta Malagueta, but he didn't bring it up in that sense. This idea of Pimenta Malagueta based on what I can tell, it's a kind of recent idea in Portuguese, the Brazilian Portuguese variant. It's something that we see quite present in the 20th century and not so much in previous centuries. That's not to say that Malagueta didn't exist early on. It did. And in fact, it was even the Portuguese who gave the name Malagueta, but to a totally different region of the world, which is Africa. And so that's the topic that I'm going to be talking about. And so the first thing I'd like to do is basically share a slide, and I will do so right now. Give me a second as I share this slide with you. Let me see if I turn it into presentation mode so it's a little bit nicer. So this was the challenge. Okay, so this is the song. It's a poem. And here we have a translation. It's not the translation that I did. It's a translation that I found later. I later found out that somebody else, an academic, had actually done a lot of work on this topic, in fact. And so this is that academic's work. But in any case, what we see here is the poem. And in Portuguese, you can see it on the left, and in English, we have it on the right. I'm going to read the English so that our interpreters can work from the English. But in any case, we see that you get to, the black bean fritter vendor, 10 o'clock at night, on a deserted street, the black woman street vendor sounds a lament. There is abara in her wooden bowl. She has an aromatic sauce with spicy peppers from the coast. There is acarajé. Oh, acarajé, the color. Everyone loves acarajé. And this song was sung by a famous singer, Carmen Miranda, and it became very popular. But as a translator, the problem was when I got to this with spicy peppers from the coast. And I was like, what is that? What kind of peppers are we talking about? Because over here on the Portuguese side, it's exactly the same thing. They just say pimenta da costa, which simply is pepper of the coast. And so when I looked at that, I said, well, I could literally write peppers from the coast, or I could go after it and have a day-long adventure of research, which is exactly what I did, because that's kind of the geek thrill of doing translation, right? So I looked up this Pimenta da Costa, and I looked everywhere, high and low, for some kind of explanation of what does Pimenta da Costa actually refer to. And as a translator, I always like to look, especially when it comes to names of plants and words like that, I look for things that are going to refer back to the Latin translation or the Latin word for the species and the genus, etc. And so what did I do? I called up my friend, who's one of the neighbors in my neighborhood, and he's actually an acarajé maker. And so, sorry, I wanted to check that there were no problems with my internet in the chat. But in any case, so one of the things that I looked for in this with my neighbors, I asked him, look, I don't know what Pimenta da Costa is. And since you make acarajé, could you tell me exactly which type of pepper you use? And sure enough, he referred me to Pimenta Malagueta. And as you probably all know, because you've researched this a little bit, Pimenta Malagueta is this pepper off to the on my left side. I hope that's also the left side, where my mouse is right now, the really intense red. And that's what we call Pimenta Malagueta, or Malagueta pepper here in Brazil. And off to the right, we have another type of pepper, which is also Pimenta Malagueta, but this is the variety of Pimenta Malagueta that we find in Africa. And so you can see they're quite different. But what really surprised me was that we're calling this deep red pepper off to the left, something that has to do with a different continent. And based on what I know about pepper, there's an active ingredient in pepper, or a compound in peppers of the Americas, that makes peppers of the Americas unique. And that compound is capsaicin. And so capsaicin is a topic that I'm quite familiar with, given the fact that when I was a college student, I used to work in a lab, and I actually had to inject the paws of mice with small samples of capsaicin to sort of stimulate pain. And the idea here was to see if by adding and injecting capsaicin into the paws of the mice and putting them on a hot plate, whether they would start licking their paws faster than the placebo group, which basically only got saline solution in their paws. And so anyway, so that's my history with capsaicin. But one of the things I know about capsaicin is that it's an extremely American compound. And when I say American, I mean all of the Americas. And so that was one of the things that also got me curious about, why are we calling this pepper Pimenta Malagueta when actually Malagueta refers to a coast in Africa? And so that was the question I had for my friend, the acarajé maker. And he told me, in fact, yes, he thinks that it's Pimenta Malagueta, the red one that we have off to the left, not the red one that we have off to the right. And so this led me to look even further. So what is Malagueta? Well, it turns out that Malagueta is the name of that the Portuguese explorers and especially slave traders, let's put it quite frankly, would call the area of West Africa, close to Ghana and Sierra Leone, these countries in that area, Nigeria even. So all of that region, which is sort of, well, let me see, I have a map to show you so that we don't get confused about what that region looks like. But all of this area here, and you can see that it's also known as Guinea or Guinea. It's this huge swath of land on the west side of Africa with the southern coast. And this whole coast was known for its spices, and it was one of the triggers for a lot of the spice trade and the search for more routes to the Indies. And that was because they were able to get some peppers out of this region of Africa. They weren't the same peppers that you could get from the Indies, but nonetheless, this was an important place for getting peppers. And it turns out, based on the work of this other academic, it turns out that a lot of the pepper that was known as Malagueta pepper that came from this region had been well known and documented in cookbooks from the Roman period and through the Renaissance. So you have a lot of references to Pimenta Malagueta, but it was always referring to this type of pepper coming from Africa, of course, not from the Americas. And what is it? So that brings us to the question, why is this a different type of pepper? Well, capsaicin, of course, is one of the key ingredients in the American pepper, but this pepper from Guinea or from the West African or the western part of Africa basically is a relative of ginger. That's right, ginger. And so this is one of the reasons that it's spicy. And there's some conjecture that says that probably people who were familiar with the spices that were used in this western part of Africa, they decided that since they didn't have this type of pepper in the Americas anymore, that the pepper with capsaicin had the same intensity of the pepper from Africa, that they would just start calling that pepper the pimenta malagueta, or the malagueta pepper. Now, malagueta, as I mentioned earlier, this word referring to one of the kingdoms of this Western African region had been well known. And in fact, this type of pepper was used in a lot of the religious ceremonies that we have even to this day, but that are particularly African. So a lot of the African religions, especially those referring to orishas, they would make different types of solutions or preparations using this type of malagueta pepper from Africa. And so you can see that when something becomes spiritual, in addition to simply being delicious and flavorful and adding a big punch to your taste buds, it becomes something that is deeply rooted into one's soul, into one's identity. And so it would be easy to imagine that people would want to still have some type of connection to pimenta malagueta, even when they're in the Americas, and that they would give that name to a pepper that is similar, but not the same, but available. And that's my theory. And I think that that's what I've gleaned from doing my reading and doing my research on this topic. Now, let me see. So as I mentioned earlier, this word malagueta is not new. And so here we have a quote from Alvise Cadamosta. And so he is one of the original explorers and somebody who joined a lot of the Portuguese expeditions to this western coast of Africa. And this quote, again, the translation, not mine, but it comes directly from this Navigazioni. Navigazioni is the journal that Alvise Cadamosta kept during his time on these journeys, on these navigations to the western coast and then later to other parts. And here what we see very clearly is a reference to Meleguete. So here he says, on this coast, there grows a species of Meleguete, extremely pungent, like pepper, resembling the Italian grain sorgo or sorghum, producing a species of great strength, not inferior to pimenta del rabo or pepe dalla coda, tailed pepper, also known as piper cubeba, resembling cubebs, which the Portuguese bring from Calicut, that is from India, but so powerful that an ounce goes farther than a pound of the common sort. Its exportation is prohibited, lest it injure the sale of that which is brought from Calicut. So as we all know, the spice trade was extremely lucrative for the Europeans, especially for the Portuguese, and control of the sources of strong spices like this one was of paramount importance because it was their way of controlling the market. And so that's important, but what's most important here is the reference to this Malagueta pepper all the way back in the 1500s when he wrote this, so that we can see that this is a long-standing tradition. It's not something brand new, but the reference here is to a pepper from Africa, not a pepper from the Americas. And I think that that's the big distinction that I wanted to make here. And again, talk about these different issues. Now, at the beginning of this conversation, I mentioned to you that I think this term, pimenta malagueta, doesn't appear as commonly in the Portuguese language as it does in the 20th century. So the 20th century really seems to be the moment that Pimenta Malagueta gets some currency. Now, this is all conjecture, of course, because I don't have a really good corpus of Portuguese. I have a much better corpus of English because, as you know, we have all sorts of resources through Google. And one of those resources, in fact, is n-grams. And I believe that you probably all know what n-grams are, but these are ways of looking at a corpus historically and seeing what types of words may or may not have appeared. And so one of the things that I was doing while I was preparing was I looked up this, it's in the other browser. I looked up the n-gram for this term, Pimenta Malagueta, in English. And it turned out that the references to it are all from the mid 20th century. And so that really tipped me off to, okay, this is something that gained more currency as we got further into the 20th century, as the Estado Novo also took on more power and more prominence in Brazil, and also gave more value to a lot of the African traditions in Brazil. And so, and some of those African traditions are the ones that we know to this day, including the African religions, the African languages like Yoruba that have still some currency in Brazilian Portuguese, and of course the unique songs of samba that come from an African tradition and are heavily influenced. And so we see all of that really taking shape in the Estado Novo period of the 20th century. And so that was what I wanted to talk to you about with regards to this pepper. And, you know, this was a journey that took me basically a full day of work. So one word, one term can basically lead you on that rabbit hole race to find something to make sense of a term. In the end, I was looking at what it is that I actually used for Pimenta Malagueta in the actual translation, and what did we use? Basically, I came back to just using Malagueta pepper, and you can see that that's different from what the other translator did in the slide that I showed you at the beginning. And let me go back to that and share it, because I think that that's quite interesting. So if we go back here and I share this screen, and we go back to the first slide where the poem was, you can see that they just used with spicy peppers from the coast. And I think that that's kind of, you know, it's a one solution. There's many solutions, as we all know, in translations, but I feel like it doesn't give us a sense of which pepper it is. And maybe that ambiguity is precisely what we need to solve this puzzle. But at the same time, it doesn't tell us which coast. And so from what I understood, this coast was maybe the coast of Bahia, but then at the same time, it's the coast of Africa. And yet what they're referring to is not the pepper from Africa, it's the pepper from Brazil. And so in my translation, I ended up just using Malagueta pepper as a way to refer to the word that we use and the term that we use in Brazil for the pepper that we find on just about every single table where there is traditional Brazilian food, including feijoada and muqueca and acarajé. So with that, I'd like to wrap up this talk and thank you for your attention. I hope it was useful. I hope I didn't speak too fast or incoherently, and that you were able to use this speech for a good translation or interpretation. Thank you.